I still remember the day my parents called the family meeting. It was a Tuesday evening in March, and the spring rain was drumming against our kitchen windows in suburban Chicago. Mom had made her famous meatloaf. Dad was nursing his second beer, and my older brother Jake came home from his management job now, tired but satisfied in a way he never was when he was chasing his artistic ambitions. He'd found purpose in helping young employees develop their skills, in solving operational problems, in building something stable and real. I come home from my accounting work, no longer resentful of the path that led me here. I've discovered that I have a talent for helping people understand their financial situations, for finding solutions to complex problems, for bringing order to chaos. It's not the career I planned, but it's the career I was meant for. We sit at the same kitchen table where everything started, where dreams were discussed and decisions were made, and futures were altered. But now we sit there as adults who've learned the difference between what we want and what we need, between dreams and goals, between potential and reality. The conversations we have now are different from the ones we had during the crisis years. We talk about our work with genuine interest and respect for each other's expertise. Jake tells me about the new training program he's developing for restaurant managers, and I tell him about the innovative accounting software I'm learning to help small businesses streamline their operations. But we also talk about deeper things, the lessons we've learned about resilience and adaptation, the ways our experience has shaped our understanding of family and responsibility, and the real meaning of success, the people we've become because of our struggles, not in spite of them. I've been working at the accounting firm for 3 years now, and I'm being considered for a promotion to senior associate. Margaret Chen has been grooming me for increased responsibility, and I've been taking on more complex cases and supervising junior staff members. Last month, I was assigned to work with a family whose situation reminded me painfully of our own. The Johnsons had mortgaged their home to help their son start a tech company, and the company had failed after 18 months. Now they were facing foreclosure, and their son was spiraling into depression and guilt. Working with them required me to draw on every lesson I'd learned from our family's experience. I had to help them understand their financial options without making them feel judged or ashamed. I had to help them navigate the complex emotions of financial crisis while focusing on practical solutions. But most importantly, I had to help them understand that their situation, while serious, wasn't hopeless, that families could survive financial setbacks and emerge stronger, that love and support could coexist with honest conversations about money and responsibility. The case took 6 months to resolve, but we were able to restructure their debt and avoid foreclosure. More importantly, I was able to help them have the difficult conversations they'd been avoiding about expectations, accountability, and the difference between supporting someone's dreams and enabling their irresponsibility. When the case was closed, Mrs. Johnson hugged me and said, "You understand what we've been through in a way that other people don't. Thank you for not making us feel like failures." I realized that our family's struggle had given me something valuable, the ability to help other families navigate similar challenges with compassion and practical wisdom. It wasn't the career path I'd originally planned, but it was meaningful work that I was uniquely qualified to do. Jake's career was progressing as well. He'd been promoted to regional manager, overseeing operations at 12 restaurants across the Chicago metropolitan area. His MBA had given him the theoretical framework to understand business operations, but his experience at McDonald's had given him the practical knowledge to implement improvements effectively. He'd developed a reputation for turning around underperforming locations by focusing on employee training and operational efficiency. His approach wasn't revolutionary, but it was thorough and effective. He understood that sustainable improvement came from attention to detail and consistent execution, not from dramatic changes or inspirational rhetoric. One evening, he came home particularly excited about a project he was working on. "I've been asked to present at the company's annual conference," he said over dinner. "They want me to talk about my approach to restaurant turnarounds." I could see the pride in his voice, but it was different from the pride he'd felt about his film projects. This was the pride of someone who'd earned recognition through demonstrated competence, not potential or artistic vision. "That's fantastic," I said. "What's your main message going to be?" "That most problems in restaurant operations aren't really about systems or processes. They're about people. If you can help employees understand their roles and give them the tools they need to succeed, most other problems solve themselves." It was pure Jake, focusing on the human element, but grounded in practical experience and proven results. He'd found a way to apply his natural empathy and communication skills in a context that created real value for his employers and coworkers. We started having conversations about our long-term goals, not just our immediate career plans. Jake was considering starting his own restaurant consulting business eventually, once he'd gained more experience and built a stronger network. I was thinking about pursuing my CPA certification and eventually opening my own practice, specializing in family financial planning and small business consulting. These weren't the dreams we'd started with, but they were goals built on solid foundations of experience and demonstrated ability. They were plans that took into account our actual skills and interests, not just our fantasies about who we might become. The mortgage payments had become routine by now, just another monthly expense that we managed together as a family. The crisis atmosphere that had surrounded them for so long had faded into ordinary financial responsibility. We were no longer living in survival mode, just managing the long-term consequences of a decision that had seemed reasonable at the time. But the experience had taught us valuable lessons about family financial planning that we were applying to our current decisions. We talked openly about money now, about our individual financial goals and our collective responsibilities. We'd learned that financial secrets and assumptions were dangerous, that honest communication about money was essential to healthy family relationships. I'd started an emergency fund, something I'd never had the luxury of doing before. Every month I set aside a portion of my salary in a separate account, building a financial cushion that would protect me from unexpected expenses or career setbacks. It was a small thing, but it represented a fundamental shift in how I thought about money and security. Jake was doing the same thing, and we'd both started contributing to retirement accounts. We were thinking about our financial futures in ways that our parents had never been able to do, because they'd spent so much of their earning years managing immediate crises and supporting other people's dreams. Mom and Dad were beginning to talk about their own retirement plans, something they'd put on hold during the crisis years. They were both in their late 50s now, and they were starting to think seriously about what they wanted their later years to look like. "We've been thinking about downsizing," Mom said one evening. "The house is too big for us now, and it would be nice to have fewer expenses." I felt a strange pang at the thought of leaving the house where we'd experienced so much growth and change. But I also understood that it made financial sense, and that my parents deserved to enjoy their retirement without the burden of a large mortgage. "What are you thinking?" Jake asked. "Maybe a condo," Dad said. "Something smaller, less maintenance, but still nice. We could use the equity from this house to buy something outright. No mortgage." It was a practical plan, one that would free them from the financial obligations they'd taken on to support Jake's dreams. But it also represented a kind of liberation, a return to financial independence after years of managing debt and supporting adult children. "I think that's a great idea," I said. You've earned the right to think about your own dreams, for a change." The conversation was bittersweet, but also hopeful. We were all moving toward greater independence and financial stability, but we were doing it together, as a family that had learned to support each other through both success and failure. As I prepared to move out of the family home and into my own apartment, I found myself reflecting on the journey we'd all taken, not just the individual changes we'd experienced, but the collective transformation of our family culture. We'd learned that love wasn't just about supporting each other's dreams. It was about helping each other face reality, make difficult decisions, and build sustainable lives. We'd learned that strength wasn't about never failing. It was about what you did after you failed, how you helped each other rebuild and move forward. We'd learned that financial decisions weren't just about money. They were about values, priorities, and the kind of people we wanted to be. We'd learned that supporting someone's dreams required honest assessment of their capabilities and realistic planning for different outcomes. Most importantly, we'd learned that families could survive financial crisis and emerge stronger, not unscathed but stronger, not unchanged but better prepared for future challenges. The house would remember everything, the dreams and the disappointments, the sacrifices and the small victories, the way we'd learned to be a family not in spite of our failures but because of them. But it would also remember the recovery, the rebuilding, the way we'd learned to love each other for who we actually were rather than who we'd hoped to become. I packed my belongings slowly, taking time to remember the different phases of my life in that house. The teenage years when I'd believed that everything would work out according to plan. The college years when I'd learned that plans could change and that adaptation was a survival skill. The early career years when I'd discovered that I could build something meaningful from whatever circumstances I found myself in. Each phase had taught me something valuable about resilience, about family, about the difference between dreams and goals. I was leaving that house as a different person than the one who'd received the Northwestern acceptance letter all those years ago. Not a better person, necessarily, but a more realistic one, a more capable one, a more compassionate one. My new apartment was small but comfortable, in a neighborhood that was convenient to my office and within my budget. It wasn't luxurious, but it was mine. I'd earned it through years of hard work and careful financial planning. It represented independence and stability and the ability to build a life based on my own choices rather than other people's dreams. Jake helped me move, and we spent the afternoon arranging furniture and hanging pictures. It felt like a milestone, not just for me but for our family. We were both moving forward, building independent lives while maintaining the connections that had helped us survive our most difficult years. "I'm proud of you," he said as we finished setting up my home office. "You've built something really solid here." "We both have," I replied. "We just built it differently than we originally planned." He nodded, understanding the deeper meaning of what I was saying. We'd both learned that there were many ways to build a successful life, that the path mattered less than the destination, that resilience and adaptability were more valuable than perfect planning. Over the following months, I settled into my new routine. Work, home, occasional dinners with my family, weekend time with friends I'd made through my job and my professional associations. It was a quiet life, but it was stable and fulfilling in ways that my teenage dreams of journalism glory had never been. I was good at my work, really good. I'd developed a reputation for helping families navigate complex financial situations with compassion and practical wisdom. My clients trusted me because I understood their challenges not just intellectually but emotionally. I knew what it felt like to watch your family struggle with financial pressure, to make sacrifices for other people's dreams, to rebuild after disappointment. This experiential knowledge made me more effective in my professional role, but it also made me more aware of the human cost of financial decisions. I found myself advocating for my clients, not just as an accountant, but as someone who understood the broader implications of their choices. One case particularly stood out. A young couple had come to me for help with their taxes, but it quickly became clear that they were facing a larger financial crisis. The husband had quit his job to start a food truck business, and it wasn't generating enough income to cover their expenses. They were behind on their mortgage, and their credit card debt was mounting. Working with them required me to draw on every lesson I'd learned from our family's experience. I had to help them understand their financial options without making them feel judged or ashamed. I had to help them have difficult conversations about expectations, accountability, and the difference between supporting someone's dreams and enabling their irresponsibility. But most importantly, I had to help them understand that their situation, while serious, wasn't hopeless. That couples could survive financial setbacks and emerge stronger. That love and support could coexist with honest conversations about money and responsibility. The case took months to resolve, but we were able to restructure their debt and develop a realistic plan for the food truck business. More importantly, I was able to help them have the difficult conversations they'd been avoiding about financial planning, risk management, and the importance of having backup plans. When the case was resolved, the wife said something that stayed with me. "You helped us understand that supporting each other's dreams doesn't mean ignoring reality. It means facing reality together." I realized that this was exactly what our family had learned to do. We'd learned that love wasn't about enabling each other's fantasies. It was about helping each other build realistic plans and supporting each other through the inevitable setbacks and disappointments. Jake's career continued to flourish. He'd been promoted again, this time to a position at corporate headquarters, where he was responsible for developing training programs for restaurant managers across the entire chain. His approach, which emphasized practical problem-solving and human-centered management, had proven successful across multiple locations. He'd also started teaching part-time at a local business school, sharing his experience with students who were studying restaurant management and operations. He found that he enjoyed teaching, that he had a gift for explaining complex concepts in practical terms that students could understand and apply. "I never thought I'd be a teacher," he told me over dinner one evening, "but I really enjoy it. There's something satisfying about helping people understand how things actually work." I could see the satisfaction in his face, the same kind of satisfaction I felt when I helped clients navigate complex financial situations. We'd both found ways to use our experiences to help other people, to turn our struggles into something useful and meaningful. The teaching also kept Jake connected to his creative side in a way that was practical and sustainable. He wasn't making films, but he was crafting lessons and developing training materials that required creativity and communication skills. He'd found a way to use his natural talents in a context that created real value for his students and his employers. As time passed, I began to understand that our family's crisis had been a kind of education in itself. We'd learned things about money management, family dynamics, and personal resilience that couldn't be taught in a classroom. We'd learned them through experience, through necessity, through the kind of pressure that forces people to discover what they're really capable of. These lessons had made us all more realistic, more practical, more capable of handling whatever challenges life might throw at us. They'd also made us more compassionate, more understanding of the struggles that other families face when their dreams collide with financial reality. I started volunteering at a local nonprofit that provided financial counseling to low-income families. It was a way to use my professional skills to help people who couldn't afford to pay for accounting services. But it was also a way to give back to the community that had supported me through my own struggles. The work was challenging but rewarding. Many of the families I worked with were facing the same kinds of pressures we'd experienced: competing priorities, limited resources, difficult decisions about how to allocate money and support. But they were also dealing with additional challenges that we'd been fortunate to avoid: job insecurity, health problems, housing instability. Working with these families helped me understand that our experience, while difficult, had been manageable because we'd started from a position of relative stability. We'd owned our home, had steady employment, and had family support systems. Many of the families I worked with didn't have these advantages, which made their financial challenges much more complex and difficult to resolve. This perspective helped me appreciate what we'd accomplished as a family. We'd made mistakes, certainly, but we'd also shown resilience and adaptability. We'd learned from our experiences and used those lessons to build stronger, more sustainable lives. Jake had also found ways to give back to the community. He'd started mentoring young people who were interested in restaurant management, helping them understand the industry and develop the skills they needed to succeed. He'd also begun speaking at local high schools about the importance of practical career planning and the value of developing marketable skills. I try to help them understand that there are many paths to success. He told me about his mentoring work. The key is to build on your actual abilities rather than just your dreams. It was a message that came directly from his own experience, from the lessons he'd learned about the difference between potential and capability, between dreams and goals. He was helping young people avoid some of the mistakes he had made, while also encouraging them to pursue their ambitions in realistic and sustainable ways. Our parents were doing well in their retirement. They'd sold the house and moved to a smaller condo, and they were enjoying the freedom from mortgage payments and home maintenance responsibilities. They'd also started traveling, something they'd never been able to do during the years when they were managing financial crisis and supporting adult children. "We're finally living for ourselves," Mom said during one of our family dinners. "It's wonderful to be able to make decisions based on what we want, rather than what everyone else needs." I was happy for them, but I also felt grateful for the sacrifices they'd made. They'd supported Jake's dreams even when it meant taking on significant financial risk. They'd supported my education and career development even when it meant years of financial pressure. They'd held our family together during the most difficult period of our lives. But I also understood that their experience had taught them valuable lessons about the importance of financial planning and the dangers of taking on too much debt to support other people's dreams. They were more cautious now, more realistic about the risks and costs of different financial decisions. The monthly mortgage payments were a thing of the past, but the lessons we'd learned from that experience continued to shape our financial decisions. We all maintained emergency funds now, and we all contributed to retirement accounts. We talked openly about money, about our individual financial goals, and our collective responsibilities. We'd learned that financial security wasn't just about having enough money. It was about having realistic expectations, sustainable plans, and the ability to adapt when circumstances changed. We'd learned that families could survive financial crisis and emerge stronger, but only if they were willing to face reality together and make difficult decisions based on facts rather than fantasies. The house was sold to a young family with 2 small children, people who reminded me of what we'd been like before the crisis. I hoped they would have better luck than we'd had, that their dreams would prove more sustainable than ours had been. But I also hoped that if they faced challenges similar to ours, they would have the resilience and love to work through them together. I hoped they would learn, as we had, That failure wasn't the end of the story, but the beginning of a different one. One that might be more realistic and more sustainable than the original plan. As I drove away from the house for the last time, I felt a mix of sadness and gratitude. Sadness for the dreams that had been lost, for the pain we'd all experienced, for the years of financial pressure and family tension. But gratitude for the lessons we'd learned, for the strength we'd developed, for the love that had carried us through the most difficult times. The house had been our classroom, the place where we'd learned about resilience and adaptation, and the difference between dreams and goals. We were leaving it as different people than we'd been when Jake first announced his film school plans. Not necessarily better people, but more realistic ones, more capable ones, more compassionate ones. Jake moved into his own apartment a few months later, a nice place in a neighborhood that was convenient to his corporate office. He had furnished it simply but tastefully, with a home office where he could work on his teaching materials and corporate projects. We had dinner together regularly, sometimes just the two of us, sometimes with our parents. The conversations were easy now, comfortable in a way they hadn't been for years. We'd learned to see each other as complete human beings rather than just roles in each other's stories. "Do you ever regret it?" I asked him one evening, as we walked through the neighborhood where we'd grown up. The film school thing, I mean. He considered the question carefully. "I regret the way it happened. I regret the cost to you and Mom and Dad. I regret being so naive about the risks and the realities of the film industry. But I don't regret trying. Why not? Because failing taught me things about myself that I never would have learned otherwise. It taught me what I'm actually good at, what I actually enjoy, what actually matters to me. I'm happier now than I was when I was chasing the film dream, because what I'm doing now is based on reality rather than fantasy." I understood what he meant. My own detour from journalism to accounting had been involuntary, but it had led me to discover talents and interests I'd never known I had. I was doing work that was meaningful and sustainable, work that was uniquely suited to my abilities and experience. Plus, he added, I learned that success isn't about achieving your original goals. It's about building something meaningful from whatever circumstances you find yourself in, and I learned that from watching you. It was a generous thing to say, and I felt a warmth I hadn't experienced in years. Not just the warmth of sibling affection, but the warmth of mutual respect and understanding. We'd both learned hard lessons about life and dreams, and the cost of both, but we'd learned them together, and that had made us stronger. The years that followed were marked by steady progress and quiet satisfaction. I earned my CPA certification and was promoted to manager at the accounting firm. Jake completed his MBA and took on increasing responsibility at the restaurant chain. Our parents enjoyed their retirement, traveling and pursuing hobbies they'd never had time for. During their working years, we'd all learned to measure success differently, not in terms of achieved dreams or fulfilled potential, but in terms of stability, sustainability, and the ability to help others. We'd learned that resilience wasn't about bouncing back to your original position, but about adapting to new circumstances and building something meaningful from whatever materials you had available. The monthly mortgage payments were a distant memory now, but the lessons we'd learned from that experience continued to shape our decisions. We were all more careful about financial planning, more realistic about risk and reward, more honest about our capabilities and limitations. But we were also more compassionate, more understanding of the struggles that other families face when their dreams collide with financial reality. We'd learned that love wasn't just about supporting each other's dreams. It was about helping each other face reality, make difficult decisions, and build sustainable lives. We'd learned that families could survive financial crisis and emerge stronger. Not unscathed, but stronger. Not unchanged, but better prepared for future challenges. We'd learned that the most important conversations were often the ones you didn't have. The ones that happened in the space between words. In the quiet understanding that families are complicated and imperfect but worth fighting for. The house had been sold years ago, but it lived on in our memories and in the lessons we'd learned there. It had been our classroom, the place where we'd learned about resilience and adaptation and the difference between dreams and goals. We'd left it as different people than we'd been when we'd first talked about Jake's film school plans. Not necessarily better people, but more realistic ones, more capable ones, more compassionate ones. And that, I realized, was the most important lesson of all. That love isn't about perfect plans or fulfilled dreams. It's about showing up for each other when the plans fall apart and the dreams don't work out, and figuring out how to build something real from the pieces that are left. That's what we did. That's what we're still doing. And that's what the house remembers most of all, was scrolling through his phone, probably looking at some film equipment he couldn't afford. I was 17, a senior in high school, already accepted to Northwestern on a partial scholarship for journalism. "Kids, we need to talk," Dad said, clearing his throat in that way he did when he was about to deliver news that would change everything. Mom placed her hand on his, and I could see the worry lines that had been deepening around her eyes for months. Jake looked up from his phone, his dark hair falling across his forehead in that deliberately messy way he'd perfected. He was 21 then, 2 years out of high school, working part-time at the local Best Buy, while supposedly figuring things out. But I knew what he was really doing. He was waiting for our parents to make his dreams possible. "Your mother and I have been talking," Dad continued, glancing at the stack of brochures on the counter. Columbia College Chicago, film school applications, letters of acceptance. "We've decided to take out a second mortgage on the house." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the rain seemed to pause. "For what?" I asked, though I already knew. The knot in my stomach was tightening with each passing second. Mom smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "For Jake's education. He's been accepted to Columbia's film program. It's a wonderful opportunity." Jake's face lit up like a Christmas tree. "Are you serious? You're really going to do this?" I watched as my parents nodded, as they talked about Jake's potential and his artistic vision. I watched as they explained how they'd already spoken to the bank, how they'd calculated the monthly payments, how they'd figured out a way to make it work. I watched as my future crumbled before my eyes. "What about Emma?" Jake asked, and for a moment I thought he might actually be considering someone other than himself. "She's supposed to start Northwestern in the fall." Dad's smile faltered slightly. "Well, that's the thing. The numbers don't quite work for both of you. But Emma's smart. She can apply for more scholarships, maybe take a gap year, work and save up some money." I felt something inside me break. Not dramatically, not with tears or screaming. Just a quiet, clean break, like a bone that snaps under pressure you didn't even know was building. "I see," I said, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. Over the next few weeks, I watched my parents transform into Jake's personal cheerleaders. They drove him to Chicago to look at apartments. They co-signed for his first professional camera, a Canon 5D Mark IV that cost more than my entire college fund. They talked endlessly about his vision and how he was going to be the next great American filmmaker. I took a job at the local diner, working nights and weekends, telling myself I was saving for college. But deep down, I knew I was just buying time, trying to figure out how to make my dreams work in a world where they'd suddenly become secondary. The house felt different with Jake gone. Quieter, but not peaceful. More like the quiet that follows an argument, When everyone's pretending everything is fine, but the tension still hangs in the air like smoke. Mom took on extra shifts at the hospital where she worked as a nurse. Dad started doing weekend construction work, coming home with paint under his fingernails and exhaustion in his eyes. They never complained, at least not out loud, but I could see the weight of their decisions settling on their shoulders like snow, accumulating day by day. Jake would call every few days, usually when he needed something. Money for groceries, help with his rent, technical support for his new equipment. His voice was always bright, always optimistic, always full of stories about his classes and his projects and his professors who really understood his vision. I started my freshman year at the local community college that fall. Not Northwestern, not the journalism program I'd dreamed about since I was 14. Community college, taking general education requirements and working 25 hours a week at the diner to help my parents with the bills they never talked about, but that I could see piling up on the kitchen counter. The first semester passed in a blur of exhaustion and resentment. I told myself it was temporary, that I'd transfer eventually, that this was just a detour on the path to my real life. But as the months wore on, as I watched my parents grow more tired and more worried, I began to understand that some detours become permanent. Jake came home for Christmas that year, full of stories about his film projects and his new friends and the industry connections he was making. He'd grown a beard and started wearing vintage band t-shirts and talking about the craft in a way that made me want to scream. But what really got to me was how he seemed completely oblivious to what his dream was costing everyone else. "You should see the short film I'm working on," he said over dinner, pulling out his phone to show us a rough cut. "My professor says it has real festival potential." I watched the film, a black and white piece about a young man struggling with the expectations placed on him by his family. The irony wasn't lost on me. "It's very artistic," I said. Jake beamed. "Thanks, Em. That means a lot coming from you." After dinner, I found myself alone with Mom in the kitchen, washing dishes while Dad and Jake watched a movie in the living room. "How are you doing, sweetheart?" Mom asked, her voice gentle but tired. I wanted to tell her everything. How I felt betrayed, how I felt invisible, how I was working myself to death just to help pay for Jake's dream while my own dreams gathered dust. But looking at her face, seeing the exhaustion and the worry she was trying so hard to hide, I couldn't add to her burden. "I'm fine," I said. "Just focused on school." She nodded, but I could see she didn't believe me. "You know, this is temporary. Once Jake graduates and gets established in his career, things will be different." I wanted to ask her what would happen if Jake didn't get established. What would happen if his expensive education didn't lead to the career he was so confident about? But I didn't. Instead, I just nodded and finished washing the dishes. Spring semester of my sophomore year, the phone calls from Jake started changing. Less talk about his projects, more complaints about how hard the industry was, how difficult it was to get noticed, how expensive everything was in Chicago. He'd started working part-time at a coffee shop near campus, and I could hear the frustration in his voice when he talked about it. "It's just temporary," he'd say. "Just until I can get my foot in the door." But I'd heard that phrase before. I'd been living it for 2 years. During this time, I discovered something unexpected about myself. The adversity I was experiencing, the constant pressure to balance work and school and family obligations, was developing in me a kind of resilience I'd never known I possessed. I began to see patterns in how people managed their finances, how they made decisions under pressure, how they navigated complex family dynamics. These weren't skills I'd planned to develop, but they were becoming the foundation of who I was becoming. I started paying closer attention to the customers at the diner where I worked. There was Mrs. Henderson, who came in every Tuesday morning and always ordered the same thing, but never seemed to have enough money to leave more than a 50-cent tip. There was Mr. Rodriguez, who worked 3 jobs and still came in with his daughter every Sunday after church, splurging on pancakes he probably couldn't afford because he wanted to give her something special. There was Sarah, the young mother who counted out exact change for her coffee, dark circles under her eyes telling the story of sleepless nights and financial stress. I began to understand that our family's story wasn't unique. We were part of a larger narrative about dreams and sacrifice and the complicated mathematics of making ends meet. This realization didn't make our situation less painful, but it gave me a different perspective on it. We weren't victims of some cosmic injustice. We were ordinary people trying to navigate extraordinary circumstances, making imperfect decisions with incomplete information. The breaking point came in March, exactly 2 years after that first family meeting. Jake called on a Tuesday evening, just like before. But this time his voice was different, smaller, defeated. "I'm dropping out," he said without preamble. I was studying for my organic chemistry exam at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd had that first conversation about his dreams. I looked up at Mom, who was cooking dinner, and I could see her freeze. "What do you mean, dropping out?" she asked, moving closer to the phone. "I mean, I'm done. I'm not going back next semester. I can't do this anymore." The silence stretched between us like a chasm. "But Jake," Mom said, her voice breaking slightly, "you're so close to graduating. You just have 1 more year." "I know, but I can't. I'm not cut out for this. I thought I was, but I'm not." I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief that the financial bleeding would stop, anger at the waste of it all, and something else, something that felt dangerously close to satisfaction, which made me feel terrible about myself. But underneath all of that, I felt something I hadn't expected. Compassion. Not for the Jake who had taken my college fund and my parents' financial security, but for the Jake who was about to face the same kind of disillusionment I'd been living with for 2 years. The Jake who was about to discover that the world doesn't care about your potential if you can't deliver on it. Jake came home the following week, his car packed with film equipment and shattered dreams. He moved back into his old room, the one that had been converted into Dad's home office. And for the first few days, he barely came out. The conversations at dinner became stilted, careful. We all danced around the obvious questions. What now? What about the mortgage? What about the money that was already spent? I watched Jake during those first weeks back home, and I saw something I'd never seen before. Genuine humility. The cocky confidence that had carried him through high school and his first year of college was gone. In its place was something rawer, more uncertain, but also more real. He started looking for work immediately, which surprised me. I'd expected him to wallow, to spend weeks or months figuring out his next move. Instead, he was filling out applications and going to interviews, accepting that he needed to contribute to the household he'd helped put in jeopardy. Jake eventually got a job at the McDonald's in the mall, the same mall where I'd spent countless hours as a teenager, dreaming about my future. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Watching him come home each night in his uniform, smelling like French fries and defeat, I felt something shift inside me. The anger I'd been carrying for 2 years began to transform into something else. Not forgiveness, exactly, but a kind of weary acceptance. But there was more to it than that. I began to see that Jake's failure, as devastating as it had been for our family, had taught me something valuable about myself. I'd learned that I could survive disappointment. I'd learned that I could adapt to circumstances beyond my control. I'd learned that my worth wasn't dependent on external validation or perfect plans. These weren't lessons I'd wanted to learn, but they were becoming the foundation of a strength I hadn't known I possessed. Every day of working at the diner while going to school, every night of studying while my parents worried about money, every moment of choosing to support my family instead of wallowing in self-pity had been building something inside me, a kind of resilience that couldn't be taught in a classroom or gained from a perfect life. We developed a routine, Jake and I. He'd come home from McDonald's. I'd come home from my classes and my job at the diner. And we'd sit at the kitchen table together, not talking about the obvious things, but somehow finding a way to coexist in the wreckage of our family's dreams. "How's work?" he'd ask me, and I could hear the genuine curiosity in his voice. "Fine," I'd say. "Just paying off someone else's debt." He'd laugh, thinking it was a joke, not understanding that it was the most honest thing I'd said in months. Mom would change the subject and Dad would shift in his chair and we'd all pretend that everything was normal. But the house remembered. The house knew what we'd lost. During this period, I began to understand something about family dynamics that I'd never fully grasped before. The way families distribute resources, attention, and support isn't always fair or logical. Sometimes it's based on who makes the most noise, who has the most confidence, who can most effectively articulate their dreams. Jake had always been the one with the grand plans and the persuasive arguments. I'd been the reliable one, the one who could be counted on to understand and adapt. But I was beginning to see that reliability, while valuable, could also be a trap. Because I was good at adapting, because I didn't complain or demand attention, it became easy for my parents to assume I was fine, that I didn't need the same level of support and investment that Jake required. This realization was both liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it helped me understand that the disparity in how I'd been treated wasn't necessarily a reflection of my worth or my potential. Terrifying because it meant I was going to have to learn to advocate for myself in ways I'd never done before. I started my junior year that fall, still at community college, still working at the diner, still living at home. But something had changed. I'd stopped waiting for my real life to begin. I'd started living it. I changed my major from journalism to business, figuring that if I was going to spend my life cleaning up other people's financial messes, I might as well understand how money worked. I took out student loans, small ones that I could manage, and I started planning for a future that didn't depend on anyone else's dreams. The decision to change majors wasn't easy. Journalism had been my passion since I was 14, when I'd written my first article for the school newspaper about the unfair distribution of resources between the football team and the debate team. I dreamed of being an investigative reporter, of uncovering important stories, of making a difference through my writing. But business felt more practical now, more relevant to the skills I'd been developing through necessity. I'd learned to budget, to negotiate, to manage competing priorities. I'd learned to work with difficult people, to find creative solutions to financial problems, to make decisions under pressure. These weren't the skills I'd planned to develop, but they were the skills I had. More importantly, I'd learned that there was dignity in practical work, in solving real problems for real people. My journalism dreams had been about changing the world through words. My business reality was about changing lives through competence and reliability. Jake and I began to have real conversations for the first time in years. Not about his failed film career or my derailed plans, but about smaller things. TV shows we both liked, books we'd read, the customers we dealt with at our respective jobs. "I'm sorry," he said one night, out of nowhere. We were watching a late-night movie, some old comedy that wasn't particularly funny but was comfortable and familiar. "For what?" "For everything. For taking your college money. For making you give up Northwestern. For being so selfish. I looked at him, really looked at him, and I saw not the golden boy who'd gotten everything handed to him, but a 23-year-old man who'd had to learn some hard lessons about life and dreams, and the cost of both. "I'm not ready to forgive you yet," I said, because it was true. "But I'm not as angry as I was." He nodded, understanding. "I don't blame you. I wouldn't forgive me either." We sat in silence for a while, watching the credits roll. "What are you going to do?" I asked. "Long term, I mean." He shrugged. "I don't know. Keep working, I guess. Maybe take some business classes. Figure out what I'm actually good at instead of what I thought I wanted to be good at." It was the most mature thing I'd ever heard him say. The conversation marked a turning point in our relationship, but also in my understanding of personal growth. Jake's apology wasn't just about acknowledging the harm he'd caused. It was about recognizing that his actions had consequences beyond his own life, that his dreams had real costs that other people had to pay. But more than that, it was about both of us learning to see each other as complete human beings rather than just roles in each other's stories. For years, I'd seen Jake as the selfish dreamer who'd stolen my future. He'd seen me as the reliable sister who would always be fine, who didn't need the same level of attention or support. Now we were beginning to see each other as people who were both struggling to figure out who they were beyond their original plans. Jake was learning that his identity didn't have to be tied to his artistic ambitions. I was learning that my worth didn't have to be tied to my ability to adapt and sacrifice. The months that followed were a period of quiet rebuilding, not just for Jake, but for all of us. Mom was able to cut back on her extra shifts. Dad quit the weekend construction work. The mortgage payments were still high, but they were manageable with Jake working and me contributing what I could. I finished my associate's degree that spring and transferred to a state school where I could commute from home. Not Northwestern, not the journalism program I'd dreamed about, but a solid business program that would give me the foundation I needed to build a stable future. The transfer process was more complicated than I'd expected. My community college credits didn't all transfer cleanly, which meant I'd need an extra semester to graduate. The business program was competitive, and I had to write essays explaining my goals and my commitment to the field. Writing those essays forced me to articulate something I'd been feeling but hadn't fully understood. I was choosing business not just because it was practical, but because I discovered I had a genuine talent for it. The skills I developed through necessity, budgeting, problem-solving, managing competing priorities, weren't just survival mechanisms. They were the foundation of a career that could be both meaningful and stable. I'd found a different kind of purpose than the one I'd originally planned. Instead of exposing injustices through journalism, I was going to help people navigate complex financial situations. Instead of changing the world through words, I was going to change lives through competence and reliability. Jake was promoted to shift manager at McDonald's, which wasn't exactly what he'd envisioned for himself. But he was good at it. He had a way with the younger employees, and he understood the importance of showing up, of being reliable, of taking responsibility. Watching Jake in his new role, I began to understand something about leadership that I'd never fully grasped before. Real leadership wasn't about having a grand vision or inspiring people with your dreams. It was about showing up consistently, about solving problems as they arose, about taking care of the people who depended on you. Jake had learned these lessons the hard way, through failure and disappointment, and the humbling experience of having to rebuild his life from scratch. But he'd learned them thoroughly, and they were making him into a better person than he'd been when everything was going according to plan. We started having family dinners again, real ones, where we talked about our days and our plans and our small victories. Jake would tell us about the new employee he was training, or the difficult customer he'd managed to calm down. I'd talk about my classes and my internship applications and my plans for after graduation. Mom and Dad seemed lighter somehow. The weight of the mortgage was still there, but it no longer felt like it was crushing them. They'd learned to live with it, to work around it, to make it part of their reality, rather than a source of constant stress. But I could see something else in their interactions with Jake and me, a kind of respect that hadn't been there before. They were beginning to see us not as children whose dreams they needed to facilitate, but as adults who were capable of making their own decisions and living with the consequences. This shift in family dynamics was subtle but significant. For the first time in years, I felt like my opinions and my choices were being taken seriously. When I talked about my career plans, my parents listened thoughtfully instead of offering suggestions or trying to redirect me towards something they thought was better. One evening in late spring, Jake came home from work with an unusual expression on his face. Not excited exactly, but thoughtful. "I've been thinking," he said over dinner, "about going back to school." I felt my stomach tighten. "Jake, not film school," he said quickly. "Business school. Maybe an MBA program. Something practical." Dad raised an eyebrow. "How would you pay for it?" "I've been saving," Jake said. "And there are night programs, weekend programs. I could keep working and go to school part-time." It was a different Jake talking. Not the dreamy artist who'd wanted everything handed to him, but a man who'd learned the value of hard work and realistic expectations. "I think that's a great idea," Mom said. I found myself nodding in agreement. Me too. But I also felt something else. A kind of protective concern. I'd watched Jake pursue one dream that had cost our family dearly. I didn't want to see him, or us, go through that again. "What's your plan?" I asked. "I mean, what do you want to do with an MBA?" Jake had clearly thought about this. "I want to understand how businesses work, how to make them more efficient, how to solve operational problems. I'm good at managing people and systems. I want to get better at it." It was a practical answer, grounded in his actual experience and demonstrated abilities. This wasn't about artistic vision or creative potential. This was about building on skills he'd already proven he possessed. Over the summer, Jake researched programs and saved money and filled out applications. He was accepted to a part-time MBA program at a local university, one that specialized in working professionals. He would attend classes on weekends and in the evenings, keeping his job at McDonald's to pay for it himself. The contrast between this educational pursuit and his previous one was stark. This time he was paying his own way. This time he had a clear understanding of what he wanted to accomplish and why. This time he was building on a foundation of real-world experience rather than abstract dreams. I started my senior year that fall, finally feeling like I was moving forward instead of just surviving. I'd landed an internship at a local accounting firm and I was good at it. Really good. I had a head for numbers and a natural understanding of business systems that my professors noticed. The internship was unpaid, which meant I was working 3 jobs: the diner, the internship, and school. But for the first time in years, I felt like I was working towards something that belonged to me, something that no one could take away or derail. My supervisor at the accounting firm was a woman named Margaret Chen, who'd built her own practice from nothing after immigrating from Taiwan 20 years earlier. She was tough, demanding, and completely honest about the challenges of the profession. But she was also generous with her knowledge and her time, and she seemed to see something in me that I was just beginning to recognize in myself. "You have good instincts," she told me one afternoon as we reviewed a particularly complex tax situation. "And you're not afraid of hard work. Those are the 2 most important qualities for success in this field." It was the first time in years that anyone had praised my potential without immediately following it with suggestions about how I could do better or differently. Jake began his MBA program the same semester. Watching him study at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd had so many difficult conversations, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Pride in my brother. He was different now. More serious, more focused, more aware of the cost of things. He'd learned to budget not just money but time and energy and expectations. He'd learned that dreams were wonderful, but they weren't worth destroying your family for. But he'd also learned something else, something that I was learning too, that there was satisfaction in building something real, something sustainable, something that could weather setbacks and disappointments. His MBA wasn't about chasing a fantasy of creative fulfillment. It was about developing the skills he needed to build a stable, productive life. The house began to feel different too, less like a place where dreams went to die, and more like a place where people figured out how to build real lives from the pieces of their broken plans. I could see this transformation most clearly in our daily routines. Instead of the tense, careful conversations we'd had for years, we were beginning to have genuine discussions about our work, our goals, our challenges. Jake would ask me about my accounting courses, and I'd ask him about his management classes. We were becoming colleagues of sorts, two people who were working towards similar goals of professional competence and financial stability. During this period, I began to understand something about resilience that I'd never fully grasped before. I'd always thought of resilience as the ability to bounce back from setbacks, to return to your original path after being knocked off course. But I was learning that real resilience was something different. It was the ability to adapt, to find new paths when the old ones were blocked, to build something meaningful from whatever materials you had available. I hadn't bounced back from the disappointment of losing my Northwestern opportunity. I'd built something different, something that was uniquely mine. I hadn't returned to my original path. I'd created a new one that was better suited to who I was becoming. I graduated that spring with honors and a job offer from the accounting firm where I'd interned. It wasn't journalism, wasn't Northwestern, wasn't the life I'd planned when I was 17. But it was mine. I'd earned it myself, and that made it valuable in a way that my original dreams never could have been. The job offer came with a starting salary that was higher than what my parents had ever made, and benefits that included tuition reimbursement for continuing education. Margaret Chen had recommended me personally to the partners, and they were offering me a position in their tax preparation and small business consulting division. "You've got natural talent for this work," Margaret told me when I accepted the offer. "But more than that, you understand what it means to work hard for something. That's going to serve you well in this profession." Standing in the office that would soon be my workplace, looking out at the city where I'd grown up and struggled and learned to build a life for myself, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Genuine excitement about the future. Not the kind of excitement that comes from fantasizing about success, but the kind that comes from knowing you have the skills and determination to create it. At my graduation party, a small affair in our backyard, I found myself standing next to Jake, watching our parents laugh with neighbors and friends. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if things had gone differently?" he asked. I considered the question. Sometimes. But I think we both ended up where we needed to be. "Even though you didn't get to go to Northwestern?" I looked at him. This man who'd been my brother but had felt like a stranger for so long, especially because I didn't go to Northwestern. I learned things about myself that I never would have learned if everything had gone according to plan. He nodded, understanding. "I learned that I'm not actually very good at making movies." I laughed. "But you're good at other things. You're good at managing people. You're good at problem solving. You're good at showing up when things get difficult. I learned that from you," he said quietly. It was the first time in years that I felt like we were really brother and sister again. But more than that, it was the first time I understood that our struggles hadn't just been about surviving disappointment or adapting to changed circumstances. They'd been about discovering who we really were underneath our original plans and expectations. Jake had learned that his identity didn't depend on being an artist. I'd learned that my worth didn't depend on external validation or perfect circumstances. We'd both learned that strength wasn't about never falling down. It was about getting back up, figuring out what was still possible, and building something meaningful from whatever was left. The summer after graduation was a period of transition and reflection. I started my new job at the accounting firm, working with small business owners and families who were navigating complex financial challenges. Many of them reminded me of my own family, good people who'd made difficult decisions with incomplete information, who were trying to build stable lives in an uncertain world. I found that my own experience gave me a unique perspective on their situations. I understood what it felt like to watch financial pressure strain family relationships. I understood the weight of sacrifice and the complexity of competing priorities. I understood the difference between dreams and goals, between hope and planning. These weren't just professional skills. They were personal insights that had been forged through years of struggle and adaptation. They made me better at my job, but they also made me more compassionate, more realistic, more capable of helping people navigate difficult situations. Jake finished his MBA program that year and was offered a management position with a regional restaurant chain. He'd impressed his professors with his practical understanding of operational challenges and his ability to work with diverse teams. The position came with a good salary, comprehensive benefits, and opportunities for advancement. I never thought I'd be excited about a job in restaurant management, he told me as we celebrated his new position. But I am. I'm really good at this, and I enjoy the challenge of making systems work better. Watching him talk about his work, I could see the same kind of satisfaction I felt in my own career. Not the desperate excitement of chasing a dream, but the steady satisfaction of building something real and sustainable. We still lived in the same house, all of us, but it didn't feel like failure anymore. It felt like family, complicated, imperfect, but real. The mortgage was still there, a constant reminder of the choices we'd made and the prices we'd paid. But it no longer felt like a burden that was crushing us. It felt like a challenge we were meeting together, a problem we were solving as a team. I'd started contributing significantly to the household expenses, not because I was required to, but because I wanted to. Jake was doing the same. We were no longer children whose dreams needed to be funded by our parents. We were adults who were capable of taking care of ourselves and contributing to our family's stability. This shift in financial responsibility came with a shift in family dynamics. My parents were beginning to see Jake and me as partners rather than dependents. Our opinions carried weight in family decisions. Our goals were taken seriously. Our contributions were valued and appreciated. For the first time in years, I felt like I was living my own life rather than just adapting to circumstances beyond my control. I was making choices based on my own values and priorities rather than just reacting to other people's decisions. Jake still worked at McDonald's on weekends, even though he didn't need to anymore. He said it kept him grounded, reminded him of the lessons he'd learned there, about work and responsibility and the dignity of showing up even when it's not the job you dreamed about. I understood what he meant. There was something valuable about maintaining that connection to the place where he'd learned to rebuild his life. It wasn't about punishment or penance. It was about remembering where he'd come from and what he'd learned along the way. Sometimes I think about the parallel universe where Jake finished film school and became a successful director, where I went to Northwestern and became a journalist, where everything worked out according to our original plans. But I don't think I'd trade places with those versions of ourselves. We've learned things about resilience and family, and the difference between dreams and goals that we never would have learned if our lives had been easy. The lessons we'd learned weren't just about personal growth or professional development. They were about the fundamental nature of human relationships and the way families navigate crisis and change. We'd learned that love wasn't just about supporting each other's dreams. It was about helping each other rebuild when those dreams fell apart. We'd learned that strength wasn't about never failing. It was about what you did after you failed, how you picked up the pieces and built something new from what was left. We'd learned that success wasn't about achieving your original goals. It was about developing the capacity to adapt, to find new paths, to create meaning and purpose from whatever circumstances you found yourself in. The dinner table conversations were different now. We talked about Jake's work projects and my clients and Mom's patients and Dad's retirement plans. We talked about the future in realistic terms, making plans based on what we knew about ourselves, rather than what we wished were true. But we also talked about the past, not with bitterness or regret, but with a kind of analytical curiosity. We'd begun to understand our experience as a case study in family dynamics and financial decision-making. We could see the patterns, the assumptions, the blind spots that had led to our crisis. This analytical perspective wasn't about assigning blame or relitigating old decisions. It was about understanding how families work, how they make decisions under pressure, how they distribute resources and support and attention. It was about learning from our experience so we could make better decisions in the future. "How's work?" Jake asked me one evening, the same question he'd been asking for years. "Good," I said. "Busy. I'm working on a really interesting case involving a family business that's been struggling with debt management." He smiled. "Sounds like you're the right person for the job." I realized he was right. All those years of watching my family struggle with the consequences of financial decisions. All those nights of lying awake worrying about mortgage payments and college costs. All those hours of working to help make ends meet. They'd prepared me for this. They'd taught me things about money and responsibility and the real cost of dreams that no classroom ever could have. But more than that, they'd taught me about the human side of financial challenges. I understood what it felt like to watch your family make sacrifices for your dreams. I understood the weight of guilt and responsibility and the complexity of competing priorities. I understood the difference between financial problems that were caused by poor decisions and financial problems that were caused by impossible circumstances. These insights made me better at my job, but they also made me more compassionate, more realistic, more capable of helping people navigate difficult situations without judgment or condescension. The house remembered everything. The late-night conversations about money, the tears my mother tried to hide, the weight of disappointment that settled over all of us, when Jake's dreams crumbled. But it also remembered the recovery, the slow rebuilding, the way we learned to love each other, fought for our potential or our dreams, but for who we actually were. During quiet moments, usually late at night when I was the only one awake, I would sit in the kitchen and think about the journey we'd all taken. Not just the individual changes we'd experienced, but the collective transformation of our family. We'd started as a family that believed in potential, in dreams, in the idea that with enough support and investment, anyone could achieve anything. We'd learned, sometimes painfully, that potential wasn't the same as capability, that dreams weren't the same as goals, that good intentions weren't always enough to create good outcomes. But we'd also learned that failure wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a different story, one that was more complex and more realistic, but also more authentic and more sustainable. Jake